Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Newsrooms Walter and Leonore Annenberg Theater. I'm Jan Newharth, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Forum. On behalf... Thank you. On behalf of the Freedom Forum Institute's Power Shift Project, I am delighted to welcome you all here tonight to mark the publication of the new book, There's No Crying in Newsrooms: What Women Have Learned About What It Takes to Lead. The book tells stories of remarkable women who broke barriers at media organizations around the country over the last 4 decades, and features interviews with nearly 100 female pioneers who share their lessons about what it takes to succeed in media or any other male-dominated organization. We are so pleased to be joined by the book's authors, Kristin Grady Gilger and Julia Wallace. Kristin is Senior Associate Dean and Reynolds Professor in Business Journalism at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism Communication at Arizona State University. She spent the first 20 years of her career as a reporter and editor at the Arizona Republic, the Statesman Journal in Salem, Oregon, and the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. Julia is the Frank Russell Chair at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Arizona State University. She was the first female editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and was named Editor and Publisher Editor of the Year in 2004. She also served as Managing Editor of USA Today, the Chicago Sun-Times, and the Arizona Republic, and led Cox Media Group, Ohio. Rounding out tonight's panel are 2 veteran journalists with deep ties to the Freedom Forum, who are both legends in the news industry. Wanda Lloyd is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications at Savannah State University. Over her career of more than 4 decades, she has worked as an editor at 7 daily newspapers, including the Washington Post and USA Today. Wanda retired from daily journalism in 2013 as executive editor of the Montgomery Advertiser. Wanda was the founding executive director of the Freedom Forum Diversity Institute at Vanderbilt University, and in 2019 was inducted into the National Association of Black Journalists Hall of Fame. She is also the author of the soon-to-be-published memoir, Coming Full Circle, Jim Crow to Journalism. And finally, fresh off her evening newscast, we are pleased to welcome Judy Woodruff, anchor and managing editor of PBS NewsHour. Judy has covered politics and other news for more than 4 decades at NBC, CNN, and PBS. Off the air, she is the founding co-chair of the International Women's Media Foundation, an organization dedicated to promoting and encouraging women in journalism and communication industries worldwide. Judy also serves on the Board of Trustees of the Freedom Forum and the advisory board of the Freedom Forum Institute's Power Shift Project. Earlier this year, the Newseum and Freedom Forum Institute were honored to present our Lifetime Achievement Award to Judy at our 4th annual Free Expression Awards. The Freedom Forum Institute's Power Shift Project is a national, industry-wide initiative to improve the quality and future of journalism by improving the diversity, equity, and culture of news organizations. The project's goal is workplace integrity, defined as environments free of harassment, discrimination, and incivility, and filled with opportunity, especially for those who have traditionally been denied it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel. Thank you.
Excellent, great. Well, I think we're going to have a fun conversation. I hope you'll enjoy it. I'm going to start out, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we ended up writing this book. So In 1996, I got a job as the editor of the Salem Statesman Journal in Salem, Oregon, and I showed up, and Kristin was there as the managing editor. And the publisher was also a woman, and many of the people who worked for us were women. And it was really unusual, back then, even to some degree today, right, to have so many women in leadership. And she and I back then talked about what makes women leaders different in newsrooms. How does it impact culture? How does it impact content? And we thought there was a difference, and we thought it was an important difference. So we sort of fast forward 20 years, and Kristin and I are working together again at the Cronkite School at Arizona State University, and she's like, I have this idea for a book. I think that there are all these fabulous stories that haven't been told of women who broke into newsrooms in the 70s and really made history. And many of you have probably seen the movie Hidden Figures. Much like women history in many places, the stories can be erased, and we want to sort of capture them. And second, we thought that we see our students every day, and we thought there's so much they can learn from these women who've gone before them. And so that's sort of how we started working on the book. So we start working on the book. It's great. We're done. We have a slight problem, which is we have no title. Well, we had a title, but they were all terrible. So
really terrible.
Really terrible. So then Kristin goes to the hairdresser.
Well, and all good ideas come from the hairdresser, right? So my daughter and I were at the hairdresser. We spent like 2.5 hours brainstorming book titles. And on the way home, it hit me. Like, one of my favorite movies of all time is League of Their Own. And you know the scene, right? We're going to show you the scene, I think, from Tom Hanks.
You let the tying run get on second, and we lost the lead because of you. Now you start using your head. That's that love that's 3 feet above your ass. Are you crying?
No.
Are you crying? Are you crying? There's no crying. There's no crying in baseball.
And it occurred to me, I can't tell you how many times I've told young women, there's no crying in the newsroom. And afterward, we thought, why didn't we think about this earlier? Because a number of the women we interviewed, and we interviewed almost 100 women for this book, and a number of them would bring up this issue of crying, that particular emotion was not acceptable in most newsrooms. And so women would, go to the ladies' room or go to their car in the parking lot or something like that to cry. So we thought it was a perfect description of what we were trying to capture.
So Kristin and I entered newsrooms in the 70s, and it was a very different time. This shows a scene in the Sarasota newsroom, and you can see all white, almost all men. The only woman is Diane McFarland, who went on to actually become publisher of the paper. But it was a very different place. Because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it became illegal to discriminate against women and people of color in employment, and so it opened doors. And so I think we thought...
Slowly.
Well, I think we thought that it was all going to get fixed, that once we all entered these newsrooms, things would change. And unfortunately, that's not the case. Here you can see the 1970 lawsuit is what really made the difference. Has anybody seen the movie Good Girls Revolt, the
Amazon series? It's
yeah,
great.
it's great.
If you haven't watched it, watch it.
So it's really great if you haven't seen it. But it tells the story of this lawsuit and how these women fought and opened these doors. The reality is, though, things did not change that much. You can see here in 1998, this is all supervisors, not just the top jobs, which is what we focused on in the book. We are not yet at parity. In broadcast, the numbers are even worse. For radio and TV, you can see them. And when you look at them for women of color, the numbers are really distressing. The reality is that as of today, there are still very few women in top leadership jobs. So USA Today was one of the first places to have a big organization to have a woman in the top job back in 1999. That was Karin Jorgensen. And I think we thought at the time, oh great, Karin has sort of opened the door. There are going to be lots of women quickly following behind. And as you can see, it has been very, very slow. And in fact, there's some organizations that have never had a woman at the top of the news organization.
And in fact, the number is actually dropping. There were more women heading news organizations 10 and 15 years ago than there are now.
So as we sort of talked about this, we thought it was important to sort of be able to think about what's possible. And let me go back a minute. I'm going to talk a moment about sort of how we got to where we are, and then we'll sort of talk about where we go from here. So Judy, I want to start with you. And let's go back to your first job and how easy it was to get that first reporting job in Atlanta.
Well, you have to back up even farther, by a year and a half earlier than my first reporting job, because I was right out of college, and spring break, I had only recently decided I even wanted to look into journalism, because long story short, I had come to Washington thinking I could get a job either working in an agency or working in politics as a woman. But the women I talked to in Washington said, no, you don't want to start in Washington. This is not a hospitable climate. This was 1968, late 60s, and I had been an intern, but the blowback that I got, the discouragement I got was really profound. I went back to college my senior year. I was at Duke, and I had a professor, and I was not crying, but I was seeking advice, because I said, if I can't do what I would love to do, which is work in politics, and he said to me, would you ever think about covering politics? And that really began the thought process that led to journalism. Long story short, that spring break, I go to Atlanta because my family was living in Augusta, Georgia, and I interviewed with all 3 news directors for an entry-level job to be the newsroom secretary, or the gopher. I was prepared to do anything, because I hadn't studied journalism. I didn't have any credentials. And 2 of the news directors just barely, talked to me. They shooed me away. The one affiliate news director, the ABC, sat me down in the lobby and said, okay, he said, I could use somebody to answer the phone and clean the film and pick up around the office, so to speak, and be the newsroom secretary. And as I got up to leave, he said, and I thanked him. I said, thank you, Mr. Conover. And he said, besides, how could I not hire somebody with legs like yours? So there I was. I had, turned away from politics thinking, the media was a great place for women. And of course, it was 1968. It was early. But then to fast forward, and then I'll shut up for a minute, I started pestering him immediately to let me spend time with reporters, with the crews, to learn what they were doing, because by then I was really fascinated and knew I wanted to go into journalism. And he said, well, I don't know why you would want to do that. We already have a woman reporter, which was true. But that's what it was like. And so then after a year and a half, and after a kind of unfortunate 6-month period where it was like Cinderella. I was the newsroom secretary during the day, but then on the weekends, they had persuaded me to interview to be the weather girl on Sunday nights, which I did agree to do.
I didn't know you were a weather girl.
This is full disclosure. I reluctantly agreed, and it was like Cinderella, because during the week I would come in and answer the phone and clean the film and empty the trash, literally. And on Sunday nights, I would come in at 6 o'clock and memorize all the weather wires in order to go on for 3 minutes at 11 p.m. and do the weather. But we mutually agreed after 6 months this was not a great career for me. But luckily, the news director at the CBS station in Atlanta called about the same time. He said, well, we've just lost our woman reporter and our reporter covering the state legislature, and you told me you were interested in covering politics. And so I was hired. But, the path was like that. And no, the doors were not open. News directors then really couldn't imagine women, because there weren't any. There were a few, but we really were so few as to be, there's a woman covering this or that.
And how did it make you feel?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I was grateful to have a job. I thought, if I can just get close to this, then I can show them, how much I wanted, and I can show them I can learn, and I'll do everything I can to earn, their confidence. But it just didn't occur to me to say, well, this is awful, I'm giving up. I really didn't get discouraged. I just thought it's going to happen.
So, and I should say that both of these wonderful women agreed to be interviewed for the book, so we include some of their stories in the book.
But we hadn't heard the leg story. Gosh, I wish we had.
But Wanda, I want to ask you about your experience, especially as a woman of color, what it was like for you to move into a leadership position in newsrooms. And you had leadership positions in several newsrooms.
Yes, I have, and I always wanted to be a leader. In fact, I was the editor of my high school paper, the editor of my college paper, so it kind of felt like...
And I understand your grandmother didn't think this was a good idea.
My grandmother thought it was a bad idea. When I told her that I was interested in journalism, not necessarily leadership, she said, well, but Wanda, I don't think I know any colored girls who go into journalism. So she just predicted that it would be a very difficult path, and it probably would have been if I hadn't been as tenacious as I was. I just knew I liked to read and I liked to lead, and I was going to get it done. So,
in the book, you describe for us an incident that happened to you in Montgomery, where there were lots of sort of things that happened that made your job difficult, but one particular thing happened that almost set you over the edge. Do you mind sharing that with us?
well, I don't mind at all. In fact, when I was leaving the Freedom Forum, Jan mentioned that I was leading the Diversity Institute here. I was leaving the Freedom Forum to go to Montgomery to become executive editor. Charles Overby, who was president at the time, predicted that it would be a difficult place for a woman and a person of color to be the editor. I wasn't the first female, but I was the first woman, but I was the first person of color. And there were a lot of naysayers in the community who didn't understand that, the saying was, they've taken our paper away from us. That meant people who didn't look like me thought that they owned the newspaper because it was their paper. And that's not necessarily a bad thing that people feel that way about their newspaper. But seeing people like me in leadership, and I was also helping to make the newsroom more diverse. And so there was a gentleman who started writing emails to me, and they were very negative, racist emails. And I thought he was just sending them to me, but I found out later he was sending them to everyone in the newsroom, including and the publisher and some people outside the newsroom. And I didn't realize, because I guess I was the BCC, he could copy people. And we never did find out who it was, but I was very disturbed by it, and I felt threatened because there were some things in the emails that indicated that he knew where I was when I was not in the newsroom, including he said, I know where you go to church. And so I had to let my pastor know that there's someone who's basically threatened me in my church. He didn't say the name of the church, but I had to assume he knew. And one day, after several days of this, I got so upset, I just left the newsroom and went down to the HR department. I just needed to be out of the newsroom. And I thought this was the only safe place that I could think of that had a door that would shut. And I went looking for the director of HR. She wasn't there, but the assistant director was in her office, and I walked into her office and I closed the door and I slumped down into a chair and I just started crying uncontrollably. And so when you say there's no crying in newsrooms, I saved my tears until
you
that
were
door
in the HR
slammed.
department. It was okay.
And I just cried uncontrollably. She just had to hold me, and she didn't know what was going on because she was not one of the people that was copied on these emails. And she kept trying to get out of me what had happened, and all I could say was ask Scott. Scott was our publisher. He knew what was going on. She sat there with me for what seemed like a long time, but I'm sure it was like 5 or 10 minutes, and just held me. And then at some point she said, now, what do you want to do now? And she said, I think you need to leave the building for a while, because she thought I needed to get control of myself, and I really did. And so she went up to my office and she grabbed my purse and walked me out the back door through the advertising department so I wouldn't have to go through the newsroom. But that was really the only time that I did find myself almost crying in a newsroom. But it was a time when I felt like being a black female was the reason I was being targeted. Obviously, I was being targeted.
So why did you go back?
Why did I go back? Because it was my job. I not only went back, I went back the same day. I went back, oh yeah.
And Wanda, what year was that? What period of time was that?
This would have been, let's see, I left the paper in 2013, so it's probably 2010 or so.
10 years ago.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Recently.
It was fairly recently, yeah. But I did go back. I mean, I went back about 5 o'clock. I went to the publisher's office first because I knew that my colleague in the HR department did go in and talk to him just to let him know what had happened. And he said, what do you want to do? And I said, I'm going back to work. And he said, I'm going to go back with you. Unfortunately, he walked me in there and he called the entire newsroom together. He had a meeting, what we call a stand-up meeting. And he said, I just want you to know that despite all these negative notes, Wanda has my full support. She is the editor of this newspaper. She will continue to be the editor of this newspaper. And we won't tolerate this kind of discrimination.
Great. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
that.
Well, and you know what's so interesting about that is, Montgomery is where, in many ways, the civil rights movement began, and that paper had not distinguished itself, particularly during the civil rights movement.
Not only is it the place where the civil rights movement began, but it's the first home of the Confederacy. And so you have this clash of cultures in Montgomery to this day. It's getting better, but certainly in 2004, when I got there, those cultures were still clashing. And so in many ways, it was my job as editor of the paper to help the community overcome some of that. And we got pushback a lot of times when we heard from editors who said the paper's getting too black, and we got pushback from white editors who said we weren't covering a lot of their society events that used to get a lot of coverage. I stopped covering some of it because it was just boring. I mean, we continue to cover some of it, but Southern culture is Southern culture, and you have to understand the line between what's interesting to a large group of people. And so there was, and we made some mistakes, I will admit that, because we did have to kind of figure out what's the balance in covering the civil rights movement. We did cover the 50th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott, and we won national awards, more than a dozen national awards for that. And so we were very proud of that. We covered the death of Rosa Parks, who was from Montgomery, of course, and we covered a lot of the political aspects of Montgomery that had a lot to do with race and class and culture.
Thanks.
So I have one more question for Wanda, if that's okay. Did you ever feel like you had to adjust your management style based on both, or maybe either or, gender or race?
Well, I had to be aware of my management style. I mean, my style is my style, so I don't think I changed it a whole lot because I was a leader of the newsroom. I think a lot of people had to adjust to my style. When I left Montgomery and when I left USA Today, the one thing that people said in my going away parties, and she's so nice. And I thought, you know what, maybe I was too nice. But my management style is to be kind of a calm person. I've never been a screamer. I've never been a person who uses expletives in my work. I get the job done by doing the job and by having conversations with people in a calm manner, usually one-on-one, because I find that more effective. But there were times in meetings when there were men who didn't want to hear my opinion of something. That happened at USA Today several times, and it certainly happened in Montgomery and other places where I worked. And I didn't like the fact that every now and then a male editor, Peter Pritchard being one of them, would say, but wait a minute, Wanda had that idea 5 minutes ago. Why is it a good idea now? And so
I think we've all had that experience.
We've all had that experience, and it just makes me very angry that we have to have those kinds of experiences. If a man says it, it must be a better idea than when a woman says it.
Well, let's stay with that theme a minute. Judy, you obviously, came up into political reporting, which was very much a man's world. I mean, you covered the White House as one of the first women to do so. How did you navigate that sort of day in and day out battles?
I have no idea. I cut my teeth covering the Georgia State Legislature. As I mentioned, I was hired in 1970 by the CBS affiliate in Atlanta to start covering the legislature, the governor's office. And by the way, Lester Maddox was still the governor, the famous pickaxe patriot of Georgia. He was succeeded by Jimmy Carter, the former peanut farmer, former state senator. So I covered the Carter administration, and I covered some city hall, and so state politics and city politics. But I think the hardest thing for me was the fact that there were very few women serving in the state legislatures. I think there were something like 190 members of the state house and about 56 or 62 members of the state Senate, mostly white men. There were African Americans who were serving. In fact, some very prominent, Julian Bond, some folks who would go on to, to play a leadership role in the civil rights movement. And they'd already played. I mean, at the time I started covering Georgia politics, they already were prominent. But it was navigating that rural-urban divide, because in the cities, in the legislators who were from the cities, who had some experience working with women in responsible positions, shall we say, as opposed to those who just had really never seen a woman working as a journalist or in any other role of significance in their community, and I'm sure there were some exceptions. There was just a real contrast, and all the journalists covering the legislature had to do that juggling act. It was different covering City Hall. I covered more state politics than I did the city, but I spent a lot of time, or some time anyway, flying around the state, going to South Georgia, Southeast Georgia, where there really was, it was very still racially segregated, even though it was the 70s. It was, we were well past Brown versus Board, and we were, well into the civil rights movement, and you could say beyond it, but obviously that's not the case. But there were divides everywhere you went, and most of them were not really being confronted. Mm-hmm. And when they were, it was women were just not part of the equation. We were not covering the women in the civil rights movement, and there weren't very many. There were a few women writing for the Atlanta Constitution, the Atlanta Journal. Mm-hmm. There was a columnist, Celestine Sibley, who was really, you know who she was, who really, I think, set an example for other women coming along. In television, each station had one woman at one point, and then at some point the CBS station hired another woman. But it was I literally don't know how. I mean, other than I took my job very seriously. I didn't want to do what I call silly stories. When they would ask me to go do some light feature, I would say, no, can you have somebody else do that? I'm supposed to be covering serious news. And I probably did that to a fault. I mean, I'm sure there were important stories, as I look back on it today, around women and around families and around health and other issues that today we all think about. But back then, no, I want to be covering taxes or highway issues or something serious.
Vivian Schiller said something very similar, that she looks back and thinks that she stayed away from those kinds of stories, that now she'd say, those are really good stories.
They're important stories, and as I look back on it, there were a number of them that I'm sure I gave short shrift to, and I shouldn't have. But it was all in an effort to be taken seriously. I didn't want to be lumped in with whatever people's concept was of women.
And did you have to sort of adjust your style to sort of fit expectations of that time, do you think?
Well, it was constantly adjusting, because I was dealing with people, as I mentioned, in covering. There were, as I said, there were folks who had a more sophisticated background, shall we say, who were used to dealing with a diverse group of journalists in their own experience, and they took me and other journalists seriously. There were others who just, sweet Judy, my dear, that kind of thing, and I had to learn how to navigate that, because I hadn't studied journalism. I majored in political science. I was literally learning reporting on the job. I had to learn from my colleagues. I mean, I was fortunately taken under the wing of a number of print and television reporters who I, got to be very close friends with, and took their advice on how to handle it. Some of it, but I was learning every day on the job, trying to figure out how to navigate when somebody won't talk to you, or if somebody looks down on you, or they minimize you by, in effect, patting you on the shoulder or on the head. And,
So in the book, we have several themes that we sort of walk through. One of the themes is balancing work and home. Why don't we start, Judy, and then Rhonda, talk a little bit about how you went about doing that. I mean, you both had these jobs that were very demanding, required long hours, a lot of juggling. how'd you do it? And Judy, you had some specific issues you had to deal with at
Well,
key
and
moments.
I ended up marrying another journalist, so that made it a little bit easier. Al Hunt, who
I don't know if that makes it easier.
Easier or harder? Yeah,
well, in my experience, it did, simply because even though he was in print, and he always thought print was better than broadcast, so I had to deal with, that kind of prejudiced attitude at home. But in all seriousness, I think being married to another journalist, we always said we could understand the highs and lows. When it's been a great day, when you've broken a story, when you've gotten something right, you've gotten the interview you wanted, when things went well at work, your partner could appreciate that. On the other hand, when you blew a story, when something didn't go well, and you came home with your head hanging, your partner could get that and be somewhat more sympathetic. But then you mentioned family. When children came along, it was a little bit different. I was covering the White House for NBC. Our first son happened to be born with a birth defect spina bifida. He had a very mild form of it, but it was enough it just rocked Al's and my world, and that we suddenly had a baby with health issues. And so we had to very quickly figure out how were we going to navigate that. And I decided at the beginning that if I was going to continue my career, I was just going to make it work. I had really wanted children. I always, people would say to me, well, how are you going to juggle? And I said, I'm going to make it work. And of course you get into it and you learn. We ended up having 3 children. That it's more complicated than that. It's just more complicated. And in Jeffrey's case, our first son, there were doctor's visits. There were just a lot of issues in the first few years of his life. It later stabilized, and then when he was a teenager, he had an injury that affected his life profoundly and our family's life profoundly. And that was another kind of an adjustment.
So can you talk about that? I think that moment you had to make some tough choices, and I thought sort of how you walked through that's really interesting.
Well, Jeffrey was injured at the age of 16 that left him profoundly disabled. He spent 5.5 months in the hospital, and when he came out, he had been a young man who was navigating school, as most kids his age. He had some learning issues, all spina bifida related, but this injury left him a different person, in effect. In a wheelchair, short-term memory impairment, visual impairment, speech impairment, and so we had a crisis on our hands, and I took off from work almost 2 months. I was at CNN then, and then when Jeffrey was transferred to another hospital, and we were frankly commuting to Baltimore because he was at Johns Hopkins and the Kennedy Krieger Institute there, where he was getting treatment and rehab and so forth. But to make a long story short, I considered stopping working because I thought, how can we had Jeffrey was 16, his sister and brother were 11 and 9, and I couldn't imagine how we could juggle it. But there was a doctor who we became very close to. He became almost like a mentor to our family, who said to me, look, I've seen a lot of families go through this. There's only so much you can do for Jeffrey. The doctors, the therapists, they're going to be doing everything they can. The best thing you can do is to go back to your work, the work that you love to do, and stay with it as long as you can. And of course, Al didn't really think about leaving work. I think I was one of the 2 who did think about it as his mother. But I thought long and hard about it, and I ultimately decided to go back to work. I took a lot of time off while he was still in the hospital. But
wow.
You tell the story in the book about when you were pregnant, when you gave birth to Jeffrey, and it was like the first time that, like, NBC on the Today Show showed the picture, and NBC photographer comes to the maternity ward and takes a picture.
And I'm looking like, my hair's in my face.
But I never asked you, and I always wanted to. You were on air while you were pregnant. Was that like one of the first times of pregnant?
I think so, because now you see women in journalism and in television,
right.
and they show proudly the belly gets bigger. And,
yeah, we hit it,
and it's great. But back then the camera would do this. First they shot me from here to here, and then it was here, and finally they were shooting me like this. And I was covering the White House literally the night Jeffrey. He was born at 2:57 in the morning, but I was at the White House that night, and people when John Chancellor announced it on the news the next night, there were people who wrote in and said, well, I didn't have any idea she was pregnant with him. What's this about having a baby?
Well.
Funny.
Anyway.
wonderful. How about you? You have a daughter.
I do.
How did you manage balancing work and home?
Well, I tell people the first thing you have to do is make sure you have a good partner. So I had a good partner. And he had a job before she was born that was demanding and had him traveling a lot. And so at the point where we decided that we were going to have a family, one of the first things he did was quit his job. And he went to work for the city of Alexandria, Virginia, which gave him regular hours. And so he could control his hours, whereas my hours were erratic. I was at the Washington Post at the time she was born, but I soon went to USA Today, where my life got really erratic. And you just could never predict when you were going to leave the newsroom in the evening. We literally would work. I went to work at 7:30 in the morning just about every day. I was one of the first people in the building and in the newsroom, and I sometimes was there until 8 o'clock at night. And I remember the night that the invasion of Iran. Iraq.
Probably Iraq, yeah.
Yeah, I was on Quaker Lane. I left the building,
Oh, yeah.
and I made a U-turn.
And went right back to work.
Went right back to work in Montgomery. I wasn't parenting then because she was older, but I will say the night Rosa Parks died was 8 o'clock at night, and all I did was yell to my husband, who was in another part of the house, Rosa Parks died, bye. And he knew he wouldn't see me for another 10 hours or so, because that was a big story. So it was all like that throughout the childhood. I was also lucky in that my mother, who had retired and moved back to Savannah, was there to take her in the summer. And so that gave us a little bit of a respite, and we were able to not have to worry about it. But I did things like read stories into a cassette tape recorder, so that I could read her bedtime stories. That was very important to me, that she hear my voice as the last person before she went to sleep.
Wow.
Our daughter was a basketball player from probably middle school. One of the things she did in Savannah was she went to camps in the summer, and she went to an all sports camp. And at some point, they figured out that basketball was really her gift. And my mother would go to the gym at the end of the day to pick her up, and the coach would say, she's really talented in basketball. He kept saying this, and my mother would tell me, and I was sort of ignoring it. Well, one day I decided I'm going to leave work and I'm going to go to a basketball game. She was in middle school, and I walked into the gymnasium, and all I could hear, her name is Shelby, all I could hear was, give Shelby the ball. Shelby, get the ball. Shelby, yeah. Shelby, do this. Shelby. I didn't even know the terms of basketball. They started talking about rebounds, and I'm like, what the heck is a rebound? But we realized that, and I walked in there in my high heel shoes. You see, I don't wear high heel shoes anymore, but I did wear high heel shoes, which she used to call stick shoes, and my business suit in the gym, where all the other parents were in jeans and comfortable because they had come home and changed clothes and perhaps had dinner, and then they had gone to a game. And I went straight from the newsroom, and many times I would go back to the newsroom after the game. But I had to realize that was the point, I think, when I realized that, there's another life, and that I need to support my child, because she's really pretty good at basketball, and she did play all the way through high school. She didn't play in college, but she was good enough that she could have. But there were things like that, like reading bedtime stories in a tape recorder, getting spelling lessons and making sure that she copied them 3 times. And we would tape one to the refrigerator door, and one in her room, and one in the car on the dashboard. So as I was taking her to school in the morning, we were doing spelling words. So I had to find the time. You have to make the time. I'm not sure that's unlike any other profession, but because of the hours we work, we had to catch time when we could. And then there were days off for like snow days and things like that. She still thinks she had an office at USA Today, because there was this tiny little closet of an office, and she would go in there with her coloring books and her Legos and stuff like that. But that was important to me, that I would bring her with me. And fortunately, USA Today was a kind of environment that it was kind of okay every now and then to bring kids to work.
Yeah. Julie and I both have 2 daughters who were basically raised in newsrooms.
Yes,
so
right. I like to say she was born at the Washington Post. She grew up at USA Today, and she matured at the Montgomery Ever.
She's a well-educated young woman.
So one other theme, we're going to switch gears, is sexual harassment. Any experiences with that?
Gee, just ask it, Julia.
I never had the kind of episode, that women leave a job for, or would think of challenging management or going to management and challenging. But there were small episodes along the way essentially my reaction when someone would say something or suggest something was to ignore it and just to change the subject and walk away if I could, or just not deal with it. Because frankly, at the time, there was nobody else I felt I could talk to about it. Eventually, of course, I confided in my husband, but this was when I was single and even as a young married person. And I don't think what I experienced was any different. Maybe it was less of an issue for me than it was for other people. But I handled it by ignoring it and by, thinking I'm going to get through this, I'm not going to dwell on it. I always remembered it. I remember the individual, I remember the moment. And so today, when I hear women say, well, this happened very clearly to me 12 years ago, 20 years ago, I'm very clear, I'm inclined to believe them because I know I remember every time somebody suggested something or almost tried something. But again, there was just no way to deal with it. There was no confronting them. It was not the climate or the time to do that. And I have to say I was fortunate in that I didn't have the kind of horrible situation that so many women have experienced.
I'm not sure we even knew what the term sexual harassment was in 1970 when I went into my first newsroom.
Right.
Nobody talked about it. Nobody called it that. But I do recall the first encounter was early in the 70s. My first newsroom was in Providence, Rhode Island, and I think I was the only black professional I know I was the only black professional in the newsroom, not in the building. And there was a janitor who would come through the newsroom, and he seemed to always want to follow me, and it just was annoying, how close he was trying to get to me. And I was offended, one, because he was a man, and I wasn't trying to, he was much older. I wasn't trying to get his affection, but also I was kind of offended because, I'm trying to do my job here, and I'm working as a professional, and, why are you doing this? But I never complained to anybody. But I really felt it more when I went to the Washington Post. So my first job at the Washington Post, I was a production editor in the composing room. So that's the room where all the machinery was, the teletype machines, and the pages were laid out in hot type. This is back in the dark ages to some of your students right now. And so there's something that the lead pages were put together on something we called the chase. It was a table, a metal table, and the floors were brick, and it was a very noisy environment. And one of the first things I had just gotten married, like literally 2 weeks married when I started this job. And I had always worn dresses and skirts because women didn't wear pants that much in the 60s or the early 70s. Yeah. So I didn't really own any pants, I don't think, not the kind you wear to work, Right. And so I realized quickly that I had to change my wardrobe because when you're working in an environment like that, you can't touch the pages, but you have to lean over the chase so you can see the hot lead type and you can tell the compositor where to make the corrections. And all of a sudden, I'd always feel somebody brushing my behind, kind of walking too close. And I didn't even know who it was because I didn't turn around. I didn't dare turn around to see who it was. It probably wasn't the same person all the time. And then there were cases where the men and they were all men, I should say this, they were all white men, all white men. There had never been a woman working in the composing room in a production job at the Washington Post. And then I started hearing they were just saying disparaging things about women and the bodies they had. And they weren't talking about my body necessarily. They might have been talking about their own wives or their girlfriends or some woman they saw in the corner when they were coming in from the parking lot. But it was offensive to have to work in that kind of environment. And so now I realized later that was also sexual harassment, even though they weren't necessarily touching me or calling me names, but to have to work in that kind of an environment. I only worked there for about a month before I went to the newsroom. I was working for the newsroom in the composing room, but I went to the news editor and said, look, I can't do this anymore. I never told him why. I just said, you know what, I'm a newlywed and I don't like the hours. And so he put me on the copy desk and that was fine. Instead of working 7:30 p.m. to 2:30 a.m. I was working like 2 to 10 or something.
But what you're saying is reflective of what a lot of women told us, including women much more who entered the business much later than we did or you did. And it was basically, okay, we're sort of part of the job. You're going to face these situations. You're going to laugh it off. You're going to brush it off. You're going to walk away. Younger generation doesn't seem to have quite that same attitude. Much more likely, the women we talk to, much more likely not to to report things, to call it out. So do you see that as a good thing, as a step in the right direction?
To report it?
Yeah,
oh,
that they're
absolutely.
speaking up about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
First, you have to recognize it. And I'm not sure I can speak for myself that we recognized it as
Right.
this term, sexual harassment, that we didn't know yet.
Right.
But I think it is important because it's not just for you as an individual, but it's for everyone else also.
Yeah, I absolutely think it's a much better thing now that people talk about it. Women talk to each other about it. They're much more open. They're more comfortable. Not in every instance. I mean, we know there are still places where it's hard to speak up. And we know in journalism, in a way, we're privileged because we can speak up, because we write about it and we speak about it. There are plenty of places in our society still where women are, they speak up at risk of losing their job.
And I think it's important what you just said, that women talking to each other. We didn't, you mentioned you
There
were the
weren't any other
only
women.
woman in the
That's
newsroom,
right.
in your newsroom, and there was no other woman in the composing room, and I hadn't yet met many of the people in the newsroom. So really, we didn't have women to talk about these things at the time.
So Kristin and I, after doing all these interviews, sort of came to some conclusions. I think we were struck by, one, the bravery of the sort of women who sort of paved the road for so many who've sort of come before them. But we all, oh, thank you.
They were.
But we also have regrets. And I guess we would say we have three big regrets. One is we didn't speak up enough. We feel like there were times, when we think back on our careers, we think of the things we wish we would have said. We don't regret the times we did raise our voice. We don't think we involved men enough in the conversation, and we don't think we did enough to change culture. That obviously it's not enough just sort of one person at a time to move forward, but ultimately it's about changing culture. I'm interested in both of you talking a little bit about your reaction to that, and if there are other things you would put on that list of things as you sort of look ahead. Where do we go from here?
Well, my initial reaction is to come back to what Wanda just said about you need a critical mass to be able to do some of these things. And I'm sure we did plenty of things wrong. I mean, ideally, it would have been better if I had confronted every person who ever said anything that treated me less than as an equal. But
That would have worn you out.
I was making this. I was making the calculation that if I wanted to keep my job and if I wanted to keep moving ahead, that I needed to just take it in and learn from it and move on. But again, there weren't enough women around to go to, and management certainly didn't. In the earliest days, didn't include women. Much later, it did, and I now work in a newsroom where the executive producer is a woman. The person who's the head of our public television station in Washington is a woman. Sharon, head of PBS is a woman. I mean, and we now look around and we see finally there are more women newspaper editors and women producers and jobs that require important decision making. But those didn't exist back then. Mm-hmm. So, but I don't know. I'd like to hear Wanda's take on this too.
Well, I don't know that I have any regrets, things that but because I made it a passion to bring more women into the business and to mentor women and people of color. So I think that's a really important aspect, and I'm hoping that the legacy really is there so that people continue to mentor and bring more people along. There really wasn't a whole lot more that we could do with such small numbers
Right.
at the time. When I went I was at the Miami Herald in terms of women and people of color. That was the first time I had seen critical mass in a newsroom. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. we had crying sessions in the ladies' room in the Miami Herald. They had a nice large room with a sofa. It was
right?
like
Yeah, I remember
kind of a
those days.
loungy
Yeah, yeah,
area.
yeah.
And we would call each other on the phone because there were no cell phones. So we'd pick up the phone and call each other individually. It was sort of like a phone tree and say, meeting in the ladies' room or something like that. And we would go in there and we would cry with each other. And it wasn't always about necessarily, I don't think it was rarely sexual harassment. It was usually feeling like we would get short shrift on stories, that we
Right.
weren't given
Yeah,
assignments.
that was a
I mean, that's the bigger issue, that we weren't put in position where we could get the right kinds of assignments. And we would see our colleagues take credit for things that we had done or ideas that we had, and we were trying to figure out how to overcome that. Because I was a copy editor and the other people on staff were reporters as African Americans, many times they would ask me to read their story first before they turned it in. There was a lot of self-doubt going on, I think we were in a situation where people would tell us as women and as people of color, well, you're not good enough, or your story's not good enough. It's not good enough for the front page, or it's not good enough to run at the length or close to the length that you turned it in, or these details don't matter, just give us a cut and dried, 3-inch story and we'll put your name on it. You should be happy about that. Well, no, we shouldn't be happy about that. We've done the reporting, we've gone out and done the work that we're supposed to do. What that matters is if you have stories that are not as important as some of our male and white colleagues, it means you're not in position to win awards. And it doesn't put you in position to get promoted many times. Right. And it doesn't give you the kind of, people, the kind of presence you need in the community. And so it's really important. That was really important to us. So those meetings in the ladies' rooms were really, really important.
So I want to make sure we have time for questions. We have 2 mics on either side, so if you have a question, you can please step up. And
I love how Wanda wrapped it all up with crying.
Yeah, very nice. And I will note, Wanda has her own book, an autobiography, coming out when is it coming out?
It's coming out February 4th.
Great.
So yeah, congrats on
Thank
that.
you.
And it really is an inspiring story coming full circle. So why don't we go to questions? Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. Joan Michelson, Forbes, and Green Connections Radio. I had the privilege of being on the stage a few months ago. My great-great-aunt was a reporter who personally kept the suffrage movement in the headlines. And the wonderful museum was kind enough to do an event with me and a couple of other very cool women reporters. And one of the things that I found in covering and hearing the story of my great-great-aunt, and remember she was 1894.
Wow.
Okay,
wow.
Talk about being the only woman in a newsroom. Okay, whole nother perspective. Is she talked about how she would ask different questions than her male counterparts, that she would choose to do different stories, excuse me, than her male counterparts, which is, among other things, how she kept the suffrage movement in the headlines, because she insisted on covering it, and she covered the story repeatedly and got her own headlines. Do you guys find, all 4 of you really, that you ask different questions than men do, that you choose different stories than men do, that your reporting is in some way qualitatively different? I don't mean better or worse, I just mean in the types of questions you might ask.
Yeah, great question.
I would say yes and no, because it depends on the story. I mean, if we're doing something on the NewsHour, for example, I don't know, on Iran or on North Korea or I don't know, covering a tax issue, for example, or even impeachment, we're, in general, we're going to be coming at it as reporters. We're going to be coming at it straight on. But in those meetings when we sit around, to some extent we do this every morning, but at least once a week we're sitting there thinking, what do we need to be working on down the line in the future? We've always got stories in the pipeline. The suggestions, I would say, from women are much more diverse and broader today than they used to be. I mean, we've been reflecting on a period when it just wasn't welcome to be different and to break outside the mold. And I felt for, I think, much of my career that I just needed to do what I needed to do. And because if I stuck my neck out too far and tried to ask for us to cover things that nobody else thought was interesting or important, I might bring it up, but I wasn't going to get anywhere because I didn't have the clout to make it happen at that point. But we're now in a different place. Women in our newsroom and men feel that we can bring up things that are completely different, completely off the board. I think journalism today is so much richer because it's not, I mean, journalism has always been important, but today we are looking at aspects of people's lives that we really completely ignored. And we mentioned some of those earlier.
I'm going to go ahead and go to the next question, just so we have time, since we only have 11 minutes left. Just keep
Thank
going.
you.
But Judy, I think you gave a great answer to
Good.
that.
Well, I
Thank you.
do have to say, I'm
yes.
sorry, I have to say.
Okay, go.
When I went to USA Today, heavily female centered editor workforce, it gave us an opportunity to do those kinds of stories and come up with those ideas. And we felt validated, we felt comfortable coming up with ideas that were different from ideas that men would have. And you've said the rest of it, but I do want to say that there was a turning point, at least in my career, going from the Washington Post, where I was for 11 years, to USA Today, where working with women made us feel more comfortable with those ideas.
Good point.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamila Robinson from Atlantic Media. Thank you so much for being here. I'm finding as leaders now in newsrooms, we are still having meetings in the ladies' room. We're still crying in the ladies' room, but we are crying tears of rage. That is where we are channeling our energy and to prevent those tears in the newsroom, but we are having tears about different kinds of issues and that we're talking about it more. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about other strategies for how you manage, not only how you manage people, but how you actually manage younger staffers as well and staff development.
Julia, you?
Oh, I get to go.
Yeah, I think this is a good Julia.
So I think I have a couple answers to that. So one is, I think we need to sort of, I think that rage is actually a positive because it's bringing out those issues and we're talking about them. That the reality is, there was so much that was just sort of covered under the rug. And that, if you can get from rage to understanding to grace, and resilience, there's a fabulous journey there. Because I think it sort of goes to the regret Kristin and I have. I think we too long sort of went along and said, okay, these are the rules, we'll do what we have to, and then, then we'll fix it all. And that never happened. And so I think it makes it messier, it makes it harder. It can sometimes sort of erupt in all sorts of weird ways, but I think it's the only way we get a solution is if we actually sort of engage in these conversations. Yay, rage. Yeah. Yay, rage. I don't know.
But those conversations that you're having need to be brought out. I mean, I think management, frankly, your leadership ought to be bringing those conversations into the newsroom. I hate to think that women have to go into the restroom to talk about all this.
I would say you should put together a group of women who are not necessarily in your own organization, but maybe, you can have a phone conversation once a month together, something that's scheduled, and you put it on your calendar that the first Monday of every month you have a 1-hour conversation if you don't have enough women in your own community. I mean, I do that in a writers group now. I'm on a phone call once a month with a group of writers. One of the best things that happened to me in Montgomery is I was given the opportunity to be in a group of women who were leaders in the community, people who worked in other kinds of, there was only one other journalist who worked in television, but the rest of them were doctors and judges and other things, but they were all leaders. And so having that dinner once a month with those women, even though we weren't talking about specifically my job, it gave me a lot of support for the situations that I found myself in.
Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to thank you all for being here, and particularly Ms. Woodruff, the way you articulated why you believe women, even from years ago. I hope you just say that more often. As a survivor myself, it was so perfect, and thank you for that articulation. Okay, my question is not at all about that. I have wanted to just ask about taking in news. I'm not a journalist. And how do you balance, how do we process news and listen for bias in the news, but balance it against our own bias? It's something I'm struggling with already as this impeachment stuff begins. It seems every time they report, the defense of the words I read, I think, no, don't even report it. The words are obvious, but then that's my own bias as well. So how do you balance, how you process it?
Judy, you want to take that on?
Well, I think you're on the spot on this one, Judy.
It's, I mean, what is true in my case is that I got into journalism so long ago that that reporters were expected to be reporters and not to give opinion. And that was what I was taught to do. I was trained to do that. And that's the only thing I know how to do. I'm not comfortable giving my opinion on the air or in my work. I try to keep my thought. Yes, I'm a human being. I have opinions. I do, I'm the product of all my experiences, so I do have thoughts. But I really do try very hard as much as I can to keep those in the background. Doesn't mean it doesn't seep through in our work by story choice, by question choice, by the way you word things. Just, again, by choosing the stories that you choose, the length that you give stories, you're choosing. But I have to say, I struggle with it because today we are in a very polarized environment. There are things going on that are deeply troubling, I think, to all Americans, whether you're on one side or the other. And I'm not a robot. I'm not a machine. I do have thoughts. But I think at this point, it serves our audience better for me to be in that non-opinion role. And I'm most comfortable doing that. That's what I do. So
If your question was, how do you as a consumer control it, you have power.
You can choose.
Turn it off, you turn it down, you turn away, you read something different. I agree with Judy. We came up in a time where a reporter was a reporter, a journalist was a journalist, and we never did give our opinion. I had a phone call just yesterday from a friend in Savannah who asked me if she could put a yard sign in because I live on a busy street, as you know. Could she put she's running for a political office. Could she put a yard? And I said, no. She was stunned. I said, no, I don't endorse any political candidate even today because I still write for our local paper every now and then, and I still consider myself a journalist even though I'm not working in a newsroom. But we're in a different place now. And so I would imagine that if she had called a younger person who didn't grow up the way we grew up in newsrooms, that person might have said yes. Might have, I'm not sure.
We're
But
still
you
trying
have
to train them
control
at the
over this
Cronkite
situation.
school, straight, neutral, objective as possible.
Right.
But you said you're not a journalist, right?
Yeah, he's not a journalist.
So
I say
you're
he
free
is-
to have opinions. I mean,
But his problem is, how does he get past the people on TV
Yeah,
or in
it's
the media?
challenging.
who do?
Yeah,
It's
I
just a
think
different
one of the
time.
things
It's a
that's
good
interesting
question.
is that we forget that there was a partisan press in this country for a very long time. Kristin and I worked at the Arizona Republic. That was once the Arizona Republican. The Atlanta Constitution was sort of formed as an anti-Reconstruction newspaper. And so, there is a tradition of partisan press that really is a big part of this history. And I think what we see now, which makes it really confusing for consumers, is there is a partisan press now in this country, and there are people still practicing the kind of journalism that Judy is. And it's sort of hard sometimes to figure out who's who in that world. And
But as Julia says, it's not new. We had partisan press for 200 years before we
did.
had a press that held objectivity as a value.
yeah.
Hello, my name is Renee Delane of Women Who Dare, and you all certainly do. I have a question for each of you. If you could each tell all of us, who would you spend the day with, whether they're living or not? If you could spend the whole day with somebody, who would you choose?
Ooh,
Oh my gosh.
gosh.
I'll start first. I'll go first. I have two people, and I did get a chance to spend with Maya Angelou one day, so I really appreciate that. Oprah Winfrey would be my choice. I'd just love to spend the day with Oprah.
I might say Christiane Amanpour. I interviewed her. She was a little scary. I was a little scared of her, but she is just so unafraid and so formidable that I have great admiration, and I would just love to see her in the field.
yeah.
I'm going to say Eve. I think, it's sort of interesting to think about the gender dynamics that exist in our world and sort of where did they begin. So I'd like to go back and talk to her about it.
What did she say?
Eve. Adam and Eve. Okay.
Wow.
First, I never heard that.
Where did you come up with that?
I
I don't know. She had a pretty hard life.
I was going to say Rosa Parks and Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah, Eleanor Roosevelt.
Both of them. I'd love to have spent time with the First Lady, who was an incredible example. And, the person, I mean, the amazing Rosa Parks. I would have loved to have spent time having a conversation with her.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good question.
Hi, Vivian Mashi. I'm a defense reporter in DC and also a Cox Media Group Ohio alum. Thanks again, Julia. So you address sexual assault towards women themselves, but I'm curious for any tips or experience you have for reporters when you're covering sources or newsmakers who are accused or have been convicted, have rumors of being sexual assaulters and rapists and that sort of thing, how you compartmentalize that in your reporting. How do you remain professional, and how do you sort of keep your mind there? Thanks.
I want to make sure I understand your question. You mean, how do you go about reporting if it's true, or how do you deal with them?
As sources.
As a source.
Or as newsmakers. So, the reports might be happening elsewhere, but they're also policymakers, they're making news.
That you're dealing with in a different story.
Right. I think one of the obvious examples is President Trump, or, there have been reports now of the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was recently accused of sexual assault. All of that is happening on one side, but on the other hand, these are still powerful people who are making news, and as reporters, you still have to cover them, even as these accusations are rolling out. So just curious if you have tips about how do you, compartmentalize that when you still have to do your job, but it's distressing information whether or not it's true.
I think it depends on the position. I mean, you've named a couple of people who certainly are very much in the news, who are still in public positions, and you just have to be able to compartmentalize. I mean, in the case you mentioned President Trump, there are serious allegations against him, and there are so many other aspects to his role as president that you have to deal with as a journalist. In general, I believe in transparency. I mean, if this is an issue, an outstanding issue with someone who is making decisions that affect a lot of people, then that needs to be part of your reporting, and you don't overlook it. I mean, you're going to be asking questions about why is this person still in a position of responsibility if they've been accused credibly of something.
But journalists do struggle with this.
Yeah.
I mean, it does affect you as a person. I don't know if you're familiar with the DART Center. The DART Center does a lot of work with journalists in trying to figure out how to handle trauma of all kinds, whether that's, covering sexual assault or an upsetting story in some ways, or covering war. And I think, and there's more attention being paid to that.
Great. So I think we're out of time, but this has been great.
Let's see. I can't see. So.
They turn the lights on.
Last one.
As long as they
I'm not
haven't
a
turned off the
journalist,
mic, you're good to go.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you all for everything that you've ever done. Seriously. From a small town boy out of southern Louisiana, I grew up watching Connie Chung. I got to meet, I can't believe I just said Jane Pauley on Amtrak. Anyway.
They turn the light up.
They just turned you off.
How do you, the lights are flashing.
In this environment, when journalism is under attack and being like a news geek, I watch how journalists are treated by this administration and by people in power as enemies of the state, enemies of the people. How, in your position, do you take your leadership and combat against that and say, no, what we do is valid. It is, we are presenting the facts. We ingest it and make the decision of how we react to it.
Well, I have to tell a story on Judy. So Judy, was it 2 years ago, was our speaker. She got the Walter Cronkite Award for Excellence in Journalism. And she gave a speech at the Cronkite School, which brought the audience to its feet because you said, do you remember?
I was quoting, it was relatively new in the president's term in office, and he was starting to talk about fake news in the press being the enemy of the American people, and I said, we are not the enemy of the American people.
And
we
the whole
are
room
here.
just...
And that was at a point when we hadn't heard it that much. Today the president said not only that, he said they're fake, but they're also corrupt. It's the corrupt media. And so it just gets ratcheted up. My answer to that is we do our job. We do our job. We report, We collect the information, we are as transparent as we can be, and that's how we stand up to that. I don't think it behooves us in the press to get into some kind of contest with the President of the United States.
Well, it was like today when you saw MSNBC reporter questioning the president, and he just attacks. Like, how do you deal with that? Like, I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime.
Well,
so
you
that's
know,
why, how do you
keep in
stand
mind
up to
also,
that?
and I know we're in Washington, so this is the story for Washington, but there's a whole world outside of Washington where the media has been attacked for generations. And so the first thing I do as a leader in a newsroom is to make sure my staff knows that they're to conduct themselves in a professional manner. And we do have to educate the public a lot. We've always had to educate the public that we have standards. You know, they think, well, journalists have no ethics, and then you tell them about the ethics. You know, I was involved in the American Society of Newspaper Editors, where we wrote an ethics policy a few years before I left the Washington area as a journalist. So we do have standards, we do have ethics, and we have to make sure our staff understands that, and we have to conduct ourselves in the way that we can. And we really can't control the president or the mayor or anybody else outside of our own sphere, but we have to let our customers, our viewers and our readers and people who consume news understand who we are and what we stand for.
And we just have to keep believing in what we're doing.
Exactly.
Yeah, what a great way to end.
Yeah.
So, thank you.